UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Well, hey there, baby.
Hey, baby. How are you?
I'm good. I'm real good. It's been a wonderful week. How's your week been?
It's been pretty good. Staying pretty busy. What about you?
I've been super busy. One of the things I was busy with this week was prepping some background artwork, which isn't what you can see behind me tonight. That's just a little test for the night show, because we're about to jump Talking Weird to another channel, which we're super excited about. And that's the Untold Radio Network, which is the brainchild of the incredible Doug Hychek, who has been on the show before, and most people probably know as the producer of Monster Quest, along with dozens of other shows. But that move will probably be happening sometime in July. There isn't a set date, but I would say in about a month or so, we should hop on over to the Untold Radio Network, which I'm super excited about.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
It sure will be. And then you'll have your green screen background as well.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So we won't have your quaint little pictures in the background. But we will have uniformity, which is good. So yeah, I can't even say how excited I am. Just to work with Doug is a dream, to be honest. So that's great news. And in fact, we have a Doug Hychek story to tell later about his own encounter with a possible Mothman, because tonight's show is all about Mothman and Point Pleasant and John Keel and the high strangeness in that area, because tonight's guest, he's been fascinated by the unexplained for over half a century. Growing up in Michigan, the March 1966 UFO flap occurred virtually in his backyard. The following November, a winged humanoid chased two couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the legend of Mothman was born. And our guest would end up really chasing the Mothman for the rest of his life. He's been influenced by John Keel and Jacques Vallée, and his views on UFOs became unconventional and moved more towards a paranormal explanation. His main area of research is what some call high strangeness, or window areas, which is what John Keel dubbed them, where disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location. He believes that studying these paranormally active locations may be the key to understanding the origin of the manifestations themselves. He has his own podcast called The High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and is a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, which is also on that same network. He currently lives in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and now works at the Mothman Museum. And he's also writing a book that deals with the underlying patterns that connect different types of paranormal phenomena throughout history. So I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird, Steve Ward. Greetings.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you back.
Yes. So I hear you recently moved to Point Pleasant.
Yes, I am. I'm a displaced Michigander. I am deep in the Ohio Valley in West by God, Virginia. I'm living in a little tiny house, inches from downtown Point Pleasant. I'm very close to the road, the very same road that the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased by the Mothman in November of '66. I can walk outside my door. I can walk down to the flood wall on the Ohio River. I can walk down to 6th Street, where the Silver Bridge used to stand. Now there's a memorial there. There's a little monument there. The names of the people, the 46 people that died that night, December 15th, 1967, are there. And on the flood wall, they have this beautiful mural of the bridge, the way it looked, the perspective, the way it used to look going across to Ohio. Now the Memorial Silver Bridge is a ways down river, and of course much bigger and stronger. Yeah, I'm right. When the Mothman Festival occurs, I can just walk there rather than having to get a room and park a long distance away just to get there real early in the morning. So I'm going to try not to lord it over everybody that has had to, get a room an hour away somewhere. So I'm have to be very, very humble.
Now, the Mothman Festival hasn't occurred for the last couple of years because of the COVID pandemic, but it's back this year. Can you tell us a little bit about when those dates are and what people can expect?
Well, it's normally it's every September, every third week in September. This year, I believe it's the 17th and 18th. And it's phenomenal. It's 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. Although we get together on Friday night and we go to Village Pizza, which used to be Tiny's restaurant, where a classic sighting of the Mothman took place overhead. And then we take people out to the TNT area. I'll explain that in a minute, before all the big crowds come in. So we get down there early, and I'll be down there very early, in fact. And we show the people around, especially people that don't know the ropes yet. But it really starts Saturday morning. And the first thing you want to do is you want to go to the information booth and buy your ticket for the TNT hayride. I'll explain that in a minute. That's the only thing that costs a few bucks. Everything else is free. And so up and down Main Street, you got everything. You've got T-shirts, food, bouncy houses. I'm sure you guys will come for the bouncy houses, right? we got a zip line. We've got in the vacant lot, we usually have the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Not quite as big as the one in the movie, but he's pretty big. And then on the road, that little side street that's perpendicular, where the majestic Mothman statue stands, it's right next to the museum. That's where usually the speakers have their tables and their books, and they're very accessible and very interesting people. They speak on Saturday and Sunday all day down at the State Theater. But now the best part of all is you got to get your ticket early because you'll sell out. We take people into at night into the dreaded TNT area. Now the TNT area was it was where during World War II, there's a great photograph in the Mothman Museum, big black and white photograph to show you what it looked like during World War II. That's where they made explosives for the war effort. It was a huge complex, and they stored them in 100 of these bunkers or sort of concrete igloos. They're still out there, and some of them are still accessible. It's now it's the McClintock Wildlife Area. It's very creepy out there in the daytime. At night, it's really creepy. So we line up at the Farm Museum. The Farm Museum is kind of toward the southern end of the TNT area, and across the street is where the old North Power Plant used to stand. That's where the Scarberries and the Mallets first saw this winged humanoid on the side road right next to it. But anyway, we go out there. We've got 3 tractors and 3 carts. Jeff Walmsley, that runs the Mothman Museum, he has the only proper hayride, really, because he's got stacks of hay on his. Brittany and I, we have what I call the old man carts with nice, comfortable seats. So those are the ones you really want to go on. But we go into this really creepy area. It's set up a little bit like a Halloween hayride, but you don't really need anything. It's so atmospheric. And like I say, I've said creepy a million times. But the first thing, I'll tell you a little bit about what happens. The first thing is we go in, and the men in black, I mean, they're right there in their black suits, black fedoras, dark sunglasses, and they try to turn you away because they tell you it's a restricted area. Fortunately, they're a little more like the Keystone Cops than the actual dreaded men in black. And as we go in, there'll be a guaranteed flyover of the Mothman. And I guess I won't tell you how we do that. I know the men behind the curtain. They hide behind the old acid plant. And if you walk into the Mothman Museum, into the souvenir part, and you look up in the ceiling, you'll see the very same Mothman that will actually make a pass over in the TNT area. So it's just a blast, and people can go there and talk to other people about this stuff. And unlike some family members and some coworkers that look at you cross-eyed like, what did you do this last weekend? And you did this on purpose, right? So it's such a good time. It's just my first Mothman Festival was 2006, and I just had a grin from ear to ear the whole time.
One of our regular viewers, Mothman 46, said that you're his buddy, and he crashed his drone while he was setting up for that hayride a couple years back. Sounds
So
like
I
a good
remember
time.
that.
How active is the area? How active is it still? As far as I know, that area is probably what you and Keel would call a window area. Is there still a lot of anomalous phenomena that takes place in the TNT area and elsewhere around Point Pleasant?
People now see. I did have one weird experience, but which I can talk about. But for the most part, I don't experience anything. People do go out to the TNT area. They do a lot of EVP work and get results. People that I've been with have seen shadow people. I don't ever see this stuff. Uh, but as far as the Mothman goes, Jeff Wamsley wrote a couple of books. He talked to a guy that saw something like the Mothman in the 90s. And there have been a couple documentaries where people have claimed to see some large bird-like creature. But it seems like, for the most part, that it was, that period in the 60s where all this activity happened. The strange lights going overhead, men in black, bedroom apparitions, missing time, and several. John Keel talked to a little over 100 people about their experience with the Mothman. And while the behavior is kind of a paradox, the general description usually is about the same: 6, 7 feet tall, red glowing eyes, 10-foot wingspan. In fact, Jeff Wamsley, who he grew up there. He was 5 and 6 years old when these things started happening, and when the bridge collapsed. And then Linda Scarberry, one of the first witnesses, he was her paper boy. And so and she would come, he would have her come to the Mothman Festival with some other witnesses, and people could talk to them. I was able to talk to her a few times before she unfortunately passed on. And so the people, they experienced something. I still don't know. John Keel didn't really know what they experienced. So, but you can't, when you have over 100 people having these experiences, it's important, I think, to listen to them and see if there's any patterns.
Yeah, it's interesting how, certainly when I first discovered Mothman, like most people, it was in John Keel's fantastic book, The Mothman Prophecies, which probably remains one of my all-time favorite books in the UFO and paranormal field. But people now seem to see the Mothman all over the place. For example, Doug Hychek, who I mentioned at the beginning of the show, who runs the Untold Radio Network and is the producer of Monster Quest, just messaged me about a Mothman sighting that he had. He was driving with his girlfriend and something swooped down to their windshield. And he says the freakiest thing he's ever seen. It dropped out of the sky on 35 West near Moose Lake as they headed south, and it headed straight towards their windshield. It never flapped its wings, and they both ducked down because they thought it was about to come and hit the car. And he said, he's never got goosebumps like that before in his life, or since, I presume. And that's an example. And I believe that would have been in Minnesota somewhere. But
Okay.
it's an example of how these things, and you hear the Chicago Mothman story all the time, for example, these days. And I remember even Monster Quest, I believe it was Monster Quest, did an episode on the Mothman in that area, the driftless type area here, in Wisconsin, or between Wisconsin and Minnesota. So what I always initially thought of is that one-off type event, or that Point Pleasant area, the thing seems to be seen more and more everywhere. Do you think that's because of social contamination, or do you think something else is going on which has made it so prevalent?
I think sometimes what people are describing isn't exactly what the Mothman was. Had kind of a specific description. We get all these very stylized illustrations of what the Mothman was, but it was kind of basic. You can go back to the old articles and the original sketches that the two couples did when they saw this thing. It was just kind of sort of man-like, but it didn't really see the head. It was almost like the head had to have been sunk down in the chest. They had, the red glowing eyes seemed to be there. The wingspan was only 10 feet. And biologically, some would say that, well, if it's 6 or 7 feet tall, a 10-foot wingspan probably isn't going to lift it. But when I said there was some of the descriptions were a paradox, was that this thing didn't always flap its wings. It triggered something when you said your friend didn't see its wings move. Sometimes it would put its wings behind it and take off straight like a helicopter. But yet it seemed like it left some kind of footprints near the old North Power Plant. There were other aspects about it that were very strange. John Keel, and then there was a Swedish researcher, Franzen, I think his name was. He was had corresponded with Keel, and he helped Keel when Keel wrote Operation Trojan Horse with the ghost planes that took place in Sweden. So Keel gave him a letter that gave him an introduction to all the witnesses and people that he had met in Point Pleasant. So he went in after John Keel, interviewed many of the same witnesses plus more witnesses. Both men found that a lot of people that saw the Mothman would go home and have an outbreak of poltergeist phenomena. Now, how does that figure? I mean, this thing isn't acting completely like a biological animal, but it's not really acting completely like an apparition either. And also, Keel had a couple people that had a close encounter with it that said it sounded almost like it was mechanical or made a humming noise. And Mrs. Tomlinson, toward the end of that year, she saw it in the TNT area, but it wasn't flying. It was moving very quickly, she said, like a robot. So, while the general description generally was the same, with some exceptions, the behavior was bizarre. And that makes me think of, Keel wrote that he found that people that experienced UFO sightings, blobs of light in the sky or apparent solid craft, and cryptids would suffer the same physical ailments, that they would have headaches, they would get aches and pains, and sometimes conjunctivitis, the eye burn that people experience when they have a close sighting of a UFO. Well, Connie Carpenter saw the Mothman. She was driving by the Mason County golf course, that one of the early sightings, and she saw this thing take off straight like a helicopter. And the next day or so, when Keel came down and started talking to people, she had a case of conjunctivitis. So how do we explain, it suggests that perhaps some of these things have a common origin. And so maybe when we ask, people are seeing these other winged creatures, perhaps it's the same source. I mean, maybe Keel was onto something when he talked about transmogrifications of energy, that perhaps some of these things are almost like, I just saw Forbidden Planet again. Monsters from the Id. Remember the great, the MacGuffin for the movie? And, you wonder, because some of these things don't seem, it's almost like they don't have a shape until we see them, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were detailing so many sightings there, and there are those individual differences. It seems then, while sometimes there almost can be a sociological explanation, perhaps, when there's a flap or, a delusion of crowds, but there seems to be a very personal interpretation as well. So regardless of whatever is initializing all of these reports, whatever that phenomenon actually is, or perhaps phenomena, maybe there's more than one thing's triggering people, but people seem to be reporting, at least in the examples that you gave, various entities or various phenomena, which almost you can't even say it's the same thing. Somebody who sees an angel one minute and somebody elsewhere who sees something that seems more mechanical. Now, maybe you could put that down to, well, witness interpretations are slightly different, but it seems to me that there's an act of the phenomena itself, or the phenomenon itself actually presents differently to different people somehow.
Well, Keel, he kind of eased people before he wrote Trojan Horse, which was hit me between the eyes. I came kicking and screaming when I read Trojan Horse. I didn't want to hear it at first, but he started out in Strange Creatures from Time and Space, which is also called the Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings. He starts talking about window areas. He's trying to come to grips with, why do these things sort of show up all of a sudden, scare the hell out of people, and then they're gone. They leave footprints, they leave physical traces sometimes. But he also said that window areas were places where phenomena would occur over a period of time, and perhaps something different would occur. It made me think of, I don't know if you've looked into there's a great book by F.W. Holliday, who was a Loch Ness researcher, and Randall Pugh, who was a British UFO researcher. It was called the Dyfed Enigma, and Dyfed is spelled D-Y-F-E-D. It's a Welsh word, Southwest Wales. It was a phenomenal outbreak of, talk about a high strangeness area, 7-foot tall silver humanoids. There were little guys that looked almost like leprechauns coming out of the same egg-shaped craft. There's a lot of parallels with possibly connections with folklore, but just an amazing amount of different things are going on. Well, the family, the Coombs family, that were on Ripperston Farm. Before they got the farm, they were living in a trailer near the coast. Well, they would look out their window and they saw an apparition of Mary in a white robe with a, what's the word I want? I can't think of it, but it's suspended in the air, and eventually she would morph into an image of Jesus. And this would go on after night, and people would come out there and they would see it. People that were really skeptical, and so several hundred people eventually would see this vision. Well, at the same time, they were experiencing poltergeist phenomena in their trailer with their closet or wardrobe, and but later on, when they got the farm. Their farm was one of the central locations of just bizarre activity, including their cattle being displaced. They would lock them up in the pen, like 100 of them or 16 of them, ready to milk them, and then they would be gone, and they'd be a half mile away at the Broadmoor farm. And it's like, what the heck is that all about? But the point is that prior to this outbreak of UFO phenomena, they were experiencing classic religious apparitions. Now, perhaps some of these things are real, and perhaps some of these things are sort of a reflection of our belief systems. I don't know. It's just very interesting that that's what Keel described as a window area, where if you go back in history, you'd find other things were going on in the same area, but at a different time.
Yeah, rural areas can often seem to be particularly haunted. Even Jen, I know, lived for some time on a farm where they had all kinds of strange phenomena, from lights in the sky to poltergeist type activity to strange figures to weird animals.
Mm-hmm.
So what Steve was talking about then reminded me instantly about your old farm location.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I've experienced all that stuff, but there's a big question mark with that. I mean, they're all kind of intertwined together somehow. It seems like it, at least.
But not just the farm. Are these things you experience other places?
I experienced majority of them at the farm.
Okay. Well, that was actually Keel's first paranormal experience. He was only about 10 years old, maybe, if that. And he was in an old farmhouse in Perry, New York, and he started to hear a rapping on the wall. And at first, being of a scientific mind, he thought, well, it's just squirrels or something. But it wasn't. It was the rapping of a poltergeist. So instead of, I would have probably run screaming into the next county. But what he did was he actually worked out a code. He wanted, for yes, 2 taps for yes, 1 for no, and so forth. So I guess he started asking questions about the war. World War II was going on at the time. So, and then he went to the library and devoured every book he could find, which wasn't too many back in those days, on psychic phenomena.
Yeah, Doug Hychek, who's posting here as Untold Radio, just qualified some of the things he said before, and maybe you've heard of things this size. Doug says its wingspan stretched across 2 lanes of the freeway. From my perspective, when it dropped straight down out of the sky, its wings were wide open. Have you heard about creatures with wings that big? Like, that's a pretty big wingspan, 2 lanes.
Right. But then I've heard of other things, like, remember the Wisconsin man bat Linda Godfrey reported on? It was quite a bit smaller, pretty ugly looking, very, very different from the Mothman. But and the man and his son got very ill afterwards when they went home, implying that there was some kind of an effect. So it just seems like there's there are, I don't know what we want to call it, but physical effects, I guess, from some of these encounters, even though there's actually no physical contact. There is one sighting that the description was very much like the Mothman. You got to go back almost 3 years to the day from November 15th, 1966 to 1963 in Kent, England. And some kids were coming back from a dance in near Kent, and they saw this light come down behind a grove of trees, and then they saw another light manifest, and then before you know it, they saw this something very much like the Mothman. It almost like it had no head. It had the wings. It kind of shuffled along like the Mothman did when the Scarberries and the Malice first saw it. Now, it did not have the red glowing eyes, but it did. It almost suggested like that it was a light that morphed into something else. We've seen a lot of situations like that. Paul Devereaux wrote a great book on Earth energies where he used the term proto-entities, and he talks about cases where people see the light or the orb or whatever, and it morphs into something else, a humanoid figure or some kind of a creature. And sometimes the craft, if we want to call it that, it seems to be connected to the entity. I mean, it's almost like one morphs into the other. So I'm not sure what that suggests, except perhaps we're not dealing with a straight physical experience.
I think a lot of this stuff actually throws the way we perceive reality under the bus. Like if we start to take some of these experiences at face value and we look at them seriously, when things morph from something to something else, and when they leave physical trace evidence, but then poof, disappear, and when something, if it was physical, like the Mothman, presumably someone would have shot it by now or found it. I mean, it's been going on for so long. So it's, to me, a lot of this indicates that our reality isn't the way that, or our reality might be the way that it is, but there's a layer on top of it or around it or beneath it, which is far more complicated than we usually imagine in our day-to-day lives.
There's I spoke recently at the Beast of Bray Road conference, and I don't know if you've heard of Lee Hampel's farm. He has a farm right almost adjacent to Bray Road. And he has captured the most phenomenal photographs. He has these trap cameras going all the time because he started having these bizarre experiences. He started finding these footprints in the snow. They would start in the middle of nowhere and then go off for a while. There was one set where it looks like there was one animal almost stepping 1 foot in front of the other. And then all of a sudden, it splits into two animals as if one was carrying the other. I mean, it's just bizarre. And then the footprints just end. They're 5-toed footprints with a pad and a heel. And he's had the DNR look at it and other people. Some of the scientific establishment have called him a liar, said that he just bought a couple of stilts and walked, all through the snow and to make but then you look at the photographs he's taken. It implies some kind of a technology or something. There seem to be drones sometimes, or there's and in some photographs it almost seems like perhaps it's a portal, some kind of energy or something like that. It's just mind blowing, and he has put carcasses out there, and you look at the timestamp on the camera, you see a mist show up, and then eventually the carcass is gone. But there's no photograph of the carcass disappearing. There's no drag marks or footprints. There have been situations where these, if you want to call them dogmen, where he's aimed cameras, where he's left bait and so forth, where he should have captured something. Every once in a while, he gets part of a silhouette or something, but it implies, I mean, these things, whatever they are, they act like animals. They respond to bait and they respond to roadkill. But there's some kind of technology or intelligence that seems to mask them as well. So there's this bizarre combination of this perhaps technology, if it really is, and these animals that don't make any sense, and we can't catch them. We could, apparently, and they don't. Their physical characteristics, their footprints, don't match up to anything else. So it's another one of these areas like these high strangeness areas, the Skinwalker Ranch, perhaps Point Pleasant back in the 60s. There that there are some patterns. It seems like there's some kind of a guest cryptid, perhaps, and then but there's also other stuff going on. Strange lights in the sky. Stan Gordon did all that research in Pennsylvania, 73, 74, Southwest Pennsylvania. Bizarre Bigfoot reports, with 3 toes, green glowing eyes that wouldn't respond to bullets, plus UFO activity, strange lights or whatever, and one of the witnesses that saw these creatures and saw the lights, his family, 15 people, saw the UFO. He had a bizarre experience where he started acting crazy in front of the people that were there, started stamping his feet and yelling and howling, and then he collapsed. Afterwards, he didn't remember any of that. But in his mind, he saw a Grim Reaper kind of a figure that gave him prophecies of the things to come. So, and that's detailed in his book, Silent Invasion. I just gave a very brief synopsis, but it's just, the point is that some of these things that occur, it's so hard. When you look at that experience, it might be tempting to say, okay, the UFO came down, it landed, it let the Bigfoots out to stretch their legs because of the long flight from Alpha Centauri or whatever, and then but I don't know that makes any sense. I use the term paranormal diorama. It's almost like the whole thing is a projection or stage somehow. We really don't understand what's going on. But I think it might be too simplistic sometimes to say, some people think the Mothman came out of a UFO because of all the UFO sightings at the time. But I think that's probably too simplistic. But I can't give you a definitive answer on what the heck is going on.
It's interesting, the Stan Gordon book, Silent Invasion, which is an excellent book. And you mentioned some of the cases in there about the Bigfoot not reacting to gunfire, for example. But that's common throughout so many Bigfoot stories. One of the 2 books I'm working on at the moment, I look at a number of encounters between Bigfoot and people which are violent, and the amount of times people have discharged firearms at Bigfoot and they either seem to have bounced off them, or the Bigfoot's just swatted at them, or the Bigfoot's disappeared in a puff of smoke or a glowing flash. Even if we go back to the classic case of Ape Canyon, where they were shooting at these Bigfoot, and supposedly Fred Beck, one of the miners in Ape Canyon back in the 1920s, when these prospectors were attacked by Sasquatches, he says he shot one and it kind of tumbled down the cliff and into the abyss. But even Fred Beck later said he didn't think they were physical. He thought they were somehow paranormal or supernatural. And certainly this is leading to the question I'm going to ask you. If we can't shoot these things and we have all kinds of trouble capturing them on film, what is the way forward, do you think? Beyond being a theoretician like I am, just sitting and reading materials and thinking about what this could be, what's the way forward for field investigators? Is there something they should be doing, you think, that they're not doing? Or is it just something which ultimately is ineffable and we'll never get to the bottom of it?
Well, my suggestion is, now when I give talks, I start out with 3 basic premises. One is that there's more than one answer to some of these things. It's unlikely that we have, if we look at UFOs or some cryptids, that there's one specific answer. There's probably more than one. Some may be very physical. Some may get into the paranormal. The other part is that after we listen to, we have to listen to the individual. We all go in to a degree with preconceived ideas. I was very much an ET guy in the 60s and loved the books by Jim and Coral Lorenzen with all those little landings of the little guys. And that's before the Greys came in and messed everything up. We used to have some very cool humanoids back in those days. But once I got into Keel, I realized that there's some problems with that. There's so many different humanoids, so many different shapes of UFOs. Is this really a grand central station where all these different things come in? So it's important to understand there's more than one answer. Listen to the witnesses. But after we do that, the key, I think, to answer your question is that then, if we're open to that, we'll find patterns. We'll find parallels and connections. You know, you mentioned some of the Bigfoots, that the Bigfoot being hit and perhaps just rolling down the hill, but not really being fatal. It sounds like the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins. They got hit so many times, would roll into a ball and then just run away. You know, does it suggest that their origins are the same, perhaps? Even though one seems to be a Bigfoot and indigenous to the earth, one is allegedly an extraterrestrial being that landed in a spaceship. So I think that that we can proceed from there if we start. That's what my my book is about, which will be out sometime this decade, I'm sure. But that's, you know, and again, I'm a Keelian. I can't, you know, once I was introduced to John Keel and then Jacques Vallée, I can't not see these things. You know, I would have to just ignore so much. You know, a classic example of one of the best books on applying Keelian thoughts, our ideas and application, is Zelia Edgar's Just Another Tinfoil Hat Presents. All the different chapters. I mean, she found some cases that I'd not heard of before, but some of the ones I knew of, when she would analyze them in a very Keelian way, I thought, oh, I didn't see that. I missed that, you know. So when I write, I can't wait. She's going to have to write some more books so I can quote from them when I actually do my book. But I really recommend that book, because that is, I mean, she's looking at these bizarre cases and, you know, and analyzing them in such a way that you are seeing these interesting patterns and parallels that suggest there's something going on that is it's just far beyond the surface of what we when we collect these reports. There's so much more that seems to be going on.
Speaking about these alternative thinkers and the books they write, you mentioned a moment ago Jacques Vallée as being an influence. Vallée was obviously a massive influence on the development of my thinking as well. But here's the controversial part of the question for you. Have you read Trinity, the most recent book that he wrote with Paola Harris? And if you have, do you have any thoughts on it?
No, but it's not about a crashed saucer?
Yeah, it's about a pre-Roswell crash near the Trinity testing site where they tested, you know, the nukes in back in the day in New Mexico. Or they weren't nukes then; they were atomic bombs. And it's a kind of a sea change in Vallée's thinking, or a return to maybe where he was thinking pre-Passport to Magonia, because it seems that he's taken a literal flying saucer crash from the 1940s seriously. And anybody who's familiar with Jacques Vallée knows he was very dismissive, as he admits himself, of stories of the Roswell crash and all the many other crashes. Roswell's just the best known one. There's so many UFO crash stories. You can fill a book with it, as some people have done. But in his book Revelation, for example, he talks about the lure of the physical and how he thinks that researchers tend to want to find something which they can pinpoint and put their finger on, and often they are tricked by the obvious nature of going down that route. But I can't see anything in that book, and I have the utmost respect for Jacques Vallée, but because I do, I have to call it out. I can't see anything in that book more convincing than any of the books I've ever read on Roswell. Indeed, I would think books like Kevin Randall's and Don Schmidt's books on Roswell are far more convincing. Not that I think something from outer space crashed at Roswell either, or extraterrestrial crashed at Roswell either, but they're far more convincing than Trinity. So I'm not sure if Jacques Vallée has some information he hasn't shared, or there's some reason that there's been this sea change in his thought. But clearly there's nothing in the book that would would have convinced the Vallée of 20 or 30 years ago that this was a genuine UFO crash.
I have the book. I just haven't read it yet. I think perhaps it just suggests that he's not static in his thinking. You know, he's open to the possibility that there is a physicality to some of this. John Keel, in some of his later interviews, he even left the door open a little bit to the extraterrestrial idea, which he had completely rejected by the 60s. So Keel's, you know, thinking was never static. And when he talked about the term ultra terrestrial, he said he used it as a literary device, and he actually got it from Ivan Sanderson. the great British naturalist, friend and colleague. And if you read toward the end of Strange Creatures from Time and Space, he talks about, I think, type 1 and type 2 cryptids. And one of the types he suggests may very well be real, like some of the Yetis and so forth, that there may be a real physicality to some of these. But, there's real problems with the ones that are impervious to bullets or whatever. And I think he was the one that suggested the idea of paranormal mimicry. Perhaps some of these things, some Bigfoots, some craft or nuts and bolts, maybe some religious apparitions are actually divine or spiritual. But there's this mechanism in human consciousness or something else going on that mimics some of these things. It's almost like the Bigfoots that Stan Gordon talks about in Silent Invasion. They're almost like counterfeits of what we might think of as a real flesh and blood Bigfoot, that doesn't have all these high strangeness attributes connected with them. So there may well be a duality going on, and that it does seem to me that in some respects it seems like there is a physicality, and we might actually being visited by some entities from elsewhere, whether they're extra dimensional or from other planets. But there is still this call it something in human consciousness, like the monsters from the id that we create or co-create. I don't, and I've also wondered, I'm going way out on a limb, and I think I'll talk about this in my book a little bit. I might have to be inebriated when I do it. I don't really drink much, but what if both are true? What if there does seem to be something that either in human consciousness that helps to create these things, or we co-create, or they manifest to our belief systems sometimes. But there also at times seems to be like there's a real physical element to some of these. What if there is another intelligence that is interfacing with us, and they're completely aware of this mechanism in human consciousness or the way we relate to it? What if they can exploit it? What if they through the force of will or technology can exploit it so that they can mask their own activities? They can hide their own activities in a way where they distort, and we see all kinds of phantasms sometimes that perhaps they have helped to create, so we don't really see what's going on behind the curtain. I mean, that's way out there, but that would explain a way that both these things could be true. Unfortunately, they both do seem to be true at times, and it's that I get pulled. I can be pulled in a way. I even got pulled to think that Roswell might be, and I had rejected Roswell completely. But if I hear a convincing, cogent argument on some of these things, I can. I'm not so set in my thinking that I can't be swayed. But the thing is, it just makes things more frustrating. I want it to be, at least I want it to be one damn thing, so I don't have to worry so much about all the other possibilities. But it doesn't seem to be the case.
Maybe its very nature is it's meant to be something that we never solve. The same way as in an old fairy tale, when somebody comes back from fairyland with the proof of, the golden souvenir in their pocket, and then they pull it out and it turns to dust or leaves in their hands. Yes. Maybe there's a part of our psyche that needs this mystery, but I'm not above or beyond thinking it might be extraterrestrial as well. Funnily enough, in something I'm writing right now, I was writing about it today actually, is what I do think, though, if it is extraterrestrial, if some of this is extraterrestrial, because I'm beyond thinking that there's just one phenomenon that can explain all of this. I think there's multiple phenomena. But if some of this is extraterrestrial, I don't think it's little gray men landing in saucers and kidnapping couples in the middle of the night. I don't think it's as obvious as that. I lean more to the type of experience that Philip K. Dick described in Valis, which he actually had, that he was receiving some kind of transmission that was activating his imagination and his perception in some way. And was that extraterrestrial, or was it God, or was it the Soviets playing mind games with him? Who knows? But if it's extraterrestrial, I think that might be what it is. I think in that capacity, it doesn't separate so much from some of the ideas of people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée and Patrick Harper and Keith Thompson. If it's not as literal as we see it, if it's something presenting a literal reality to us, which is easier for us to accept, then that, I think, I'm totally down with accepting that as a possibility. That to me makes some level of sense. You mentioned before too, just quickly, how before the Greys came and muddied everything up, I think you said, there were lots of different entities. And to me, that's suggestive too that somehow there's cultural contamination here. Because if once upon a time there were all these different entities, so there were creatures like the Flatwoods Monster, there were things like the Hopkinsville Goblin, there were people who were like, looked like they were wrapped in aluminum foil, there was enormous creatures, little creatures, people as beautiful as Brad Pitt in his prime with long blonde hair. If that's what we used to see, that is more reminiscent of the Mothman type experiences you're talking about, where everybody sees things slightly differently. When eventually the gray extraterrestrial became so culturally prominent, not just visually or not just at the kind of the science fiction level, but the very term gray extraterrestrial is interestingly in Adam Go-Rightly's book, what's it called? Kooks, Spooks and Saucers, or whatever that title of the book is. He mentions how that very term grey was part of that bigger psyop, which people like Rick Doty and William Moore were running back in the day. William Moore himself, in an extract in that book, says we just invented the term grey and it took off. So you have to wonder how much of this of people seeing now only mainly grey extraterrestrials, or at least through the 90s when abduction was at its peak, was because of social contamination, both from science fiction, lots of UFO books about it, and also because apparently there'd been this effort to introduce the term greys along with all of this other kind of ridiculous stuff, which was invented whole cloth by members of military, or if it wasn't invented whole cloth, an awful lot of it was disinformation by military intelligence back in the early to mid 1980s.
And while you could find something that looked like a gray in the old days occasionally, they didn't really seem to show up in mass until two things happened: Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Whitley Strieber's book Communion, with that an image on the front, late 70s, early 80s. And then while you still get a variety now and then, and while you used to get a gray once in a while, now they're predominant. But earlier you mentioned, I love the connections between elements of folklore and some UFO experiences. And when you talked about, you try and get that treasure out of fairyland and it turns into a spider or dust or whatever, or it's not the gold you thought it was. Well, remember Betty and Barney Hill, they're on board the craft. Betty sees that book and she wants the book because it has photographs in it, strange writing. And if nobody believes her, she'll have this to prove her experience. And the leader said she could have it. And then they're about to leave. The leader comes to her and says, "I'm sorry, we have to take back the book. The others object." And she's so upset, but you just can't get those treasures out of fairyland or across the threshold of a spaceship. And of course we have the missing time phenomena. Even I mentioned doveed whales, these 7-foot silver humanoids. Sometimes people in proximity would get some kind of a weird dermatological condition, skin condition. Well, it's perhaps similar to what they used to call elf disease or elf burn. It's just amazing, some of the parallels that come up.
Yeah, it's hard to look at flying saucer reports, and particularly those that include encounters with the crew or the occupants, and not draw those parallels to earlier traditions in folklore and fairy faith if you're familiar with it. And of course, that was one of the great failings of a lot of the big alien abduction researchers like Bud Hopkins, who's now deceased, and David Jacobs, who should have known better because he was an historian, were inept when it came to identifying those folklore parallels. I spoke to Bud at Fort Fest, where I also got to spend some time with John Keel way back in 1999. And Bud Hopkins was a lovely man. I mean, personally, he was lovely. I had breakfast with him one day, and I asked him, he was lecturing that day on the types of marks that abductees sometimes have on their bodies after their experience. And I made the parallel, I don't think I even invented it, I probably read it somewhere, that what about similar stories in folklore where people who have encounters with the devil or witches or the like end up with marks on their body? And he said, oh, that's all stew-pot thinking. And then I started talking about fairy parallels. And he said, well, you know what? There's no commonality between alien abductions and fairy stories. There's no pot of gold in an abduction story. And I'm thinking, there's hardly a pot of gold in a rainbow. That's what he said, rainbows and pots of gold in any fairy story. Sure, there's probably a couple in Irish folklore I'm unaware of where there's a rainbow and a pot of gold. It's from a Lucky Charms commercial. It's not anything, anybody who's au fait with fairy lore, it's instantly going to come to mind. And finally, his wife, his ex-wife, Carol Ramey, when they got divorced, when they got divorced, mentioned that she was horrified that they were so unable to draw any parallels with religious or with folkloric traditions. And Hopkins and his other team members or the people around him were oblivious to those parallels. And I don't even know how you can look at any of this material, whatever it is, and not look at it comparatively. That's my bias as an historian. But I can't just look at something and pretend it popped into reality in 1947. There's all these older traditions, which all of this, as you've been saying, is a part of.
I was just reading a case. It was in a Timothy Good book, I think. And it was a Frenchman that was, it was still during the war, and he was forced to join some kind of I don't know, work organization or whatever under the Nazis. But he had this one day off, and he's walking across the countryside. He sees this landed craft, and this one, it's kind of a hexagon thing with rings around it. Another interesting, characteristic. There's a woman there that seems to be digging sand out around it. Now, I don't know how she got her flying saucer stuck in the sand, but we won't go there. But the first description is she almost sounds like an Adamski Venusian. She's got this long blonde hair, and she's very pale, very white, and but then as it gets closer to her and the description goes on, she has sort of an Asian countenance. She has the slanted eyes. She has the long tapering fingers, the very same thing that Keel kept finding in some of these encounter cases, even some of the Men in Black. And I thought, that's just bizarre. Now, this was prior to 1947. And so there's all these lost cases that if we can just, John Keel, he wrote one time, he thought perhaps if we could somehow gather all the information that's out there, all these different people have, we might actually solve some of this if somehow we could collate all this. But everybody's off doing their own thing. Some people are very, whatever field they're in, they're very opposed to dealing with high strangeness or dealing with patterns and parallels, just like Bud Hopkins, like you just mentioned. He was missing some really obvious things. Jacques Vallée demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that some modern day UX experiences have parallels with various traditions of folklore. Whatever, and I'm not suggesting that leprechauns are driving flying saucers, or that or that UFO knots used to sport little green tunics and red caps. But sometimes you look at the description of the entity, and if you switched out their little silver coveralls with a green tunic and red cap, they would look pretty much the same.
Yeah, it's interesting when we start to look at some of those physiological similarities in reports that you were mentioning, where you have those long tapered fingers or Asiatic features, which used to be mentioned quite a bit back in the day. It makes me think of Mac Tonnies' thesis in the book, which was published posthumously, Crypto-Terrestrials, because he suggests, and this is if I get physical, where my allegiance moves closer to the extraterrestrial, that there might be, and not just now, but for thousands of years, an alternative race or civilization living aside us. essentially the fair folk or the fairies, and now they're presenting intentionally as extraterrestrial. They've put on that mask as extraterrestrial now because that's what we expect. But they're actually from here. They're not from some distant planet or solar system millions of light years away. They live somehow beside us or beneath us, or just maybe on the other side of a thin veil which separates our reality from theirs. And certainly that's what all types of traditions folklorically have taught us, whether it's the fairy faith of Ireland, or whether it's the Holder folk or the hidden people of Iceland, or whether it's the tattoo. What is the name of the what's the name of the people in Mexico, the little people? I just read my daughter a fairy tale with them Sorry, what's that?
The Ecals, the little
I think it's the duendes I'm thinking of. But that's probably another one. My point is they're everywhere. Exactly. This idea that this other race of species, which is humanoid but non-human, has lived near us forever. It doesn't seem that big. It doesn't seem any bigger stretch to me that if there's a physical explanation, that's what it is. Particularly the idea that they zone in and out of this reality to one parked next to us. I don't know what that's a more literal interpretation than the Lay's interpretation that we were talking about before in Passport to Magonia, but certainly it's an interesting interpretation. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, sometimes I just stay in a state of flux because, I don't know what the hell's going on. But remember Joe Symington and his encounter. He in Eagle River, Wisconsin, 61 or so. The craft comes down and he gives him some water. They give him some cosmic pancakes, which taste terrible, by the way. And the local judge that interviews him and says, "Joe, what do these guys look like? Little green men?" And Joe said, "No, Judge, they're kind of swarthy like Italians." So, do we have was there a secret space program out of Naples or something? But the thing is, when John Keel in Trojan Horse, he quotes part of a old news conference with General Spaatz. He was one of the big generals of World War II. And in part of this conference, so I don't know the context, but he says, there's no truth to the rumor that Spaniards are driving flying saucers or that they're coming from Spain. Okay, so we got a secret space program in Madrid. but the thing is, Keel said when he was, this is way back, just before the Greys, he was some of the entities or the UFO pilots or UFOnauts, whatever you want to call them, that people would see step out of these things. And their description wasn't terribly sophisticated. They would say, well, they look kind of foreign, dark foreign types, but they weren't that good at coming up with an ethnicity. So that kind of follows that same trend. And then if you get again into some of the Men in Black lore, it's the same kind of an entity. And then just recently, this was a report given to Jacques Vallée. The Yakima Reservation was a very high activity area in Washington State. Well, there was a guy in 1928. He's driving along in his Model A, and he comes over a rise and sees a kind of a saucer-like craft. And when he looks inside the window and sees this thing from the shoulders up, he said he could pass for an Italian. So, and then one other thing I can throw in there, when John Keel would go around, he'd get these reports of these mysterious men in black that would show up, acting very strangely sometimes, maybe sometimes suggesting that they don't talk about their UFO sighting or whatever. He carried around a whole bunch of photographs of different ethnic groups. The one ethnic group that kept surfacing that these guys looked like or looked similar to were Laplanders. And if you look at a photograph of the Laplanders, they do have a bit of a slanted eye or Asian countenance, however you want to describe it, and dark skin. Now, he wasn't suggesting that the government or there was a team of Laplanders going out silencing UFO witnesses. It's just that these patterns were showing up, and which I don't know what to make of them, but it's, and I don't know if that's still going on. There may be a whole shift. Who was it? Ted Phillips, who did all those investigations into the CE2s, the trace landing cases and the effects on people and land and so forth, said that the type of craft or whatever has changed over the years. It used to be the more metallic, more saucer-like, and now they're more like blobs of light. So these things do seem to change or shift. And, is it something we're doing collectively, unconsciously, again, co-creating some of this? Or is it completely separate from us and just goes about its own way and just manifests in these different ways?
Yeah, we had Thomas Ferrario on the show not that long ago, who now has taken over Ted Phillips' work at Morley Woods, which is another one of those locations we were talking about before, in a rural type property
Yep.
where there's strange animals, strange lights in the sky. So that almost brings us full circle to where we started. And often I think this phenomenon often wants to drive us full circle. I think that the way Charles Fort said, one measures a circle anywhere. You can really jump off into a lot of this stuff, starting wherever you want to, and just follow the trail. And if you're paying attention, and if you look beyond just the one type of paranormal phenomenon and look at more phenomena, you start to see these patterns develop. And I know you're looking at that in your upcoming book as well.
Well, I've got a question for both of you.
Okay.
Dean and Jen. So we get immersed in these things and we go around in circles, and it's baffling. And we continue. There's something inherent in us that keeps us going forward, even though, people say the more you learn, the more you don't know. And in this field, it's absolutely true. The more you seem to put to, have you ever think, oh, I've got it now. There's this pattern here. This is kind of making sense. And then something else comes in and destroys it, So why are we wired this way, yet we can't seem to have a perfect solution to some of these things?
How do you feel about that, Jen?
I'm just completely intrigued by it. The more I don't know, the more I want to know. But obviously, we still don't get the answers. So I don't have a good answer for that one at all. I'm intrigued by it. So
that's the way I feel. It's just it's fascinating, and yeah. I've got this amazing library here, and once in a while, when I stop trying to get my house organized, I'll pick up one of these books, and I've got all this really old stuff that goes back several decades, and you just find just incredible gems in there. These reports have been going on forever, and but I do think, I feel that we have made some progress. I mean, John Keel probably advanced us 100 years ahead. I think of Rosemary Ellen Guiley in the foreword to Brent Rain's book, said that he was really the first guy to really make those connections between all paranormal phenomena. And remember Nick Redfern wrote in Black Diary that John Keel was way ahead of his time, and in whatever afterlife domain he is now, he probably still is.
I think without Keel, we at Keel and Valet, because they both had different similar but different roles in moving us forward. But I think without those thinkers, the UFO or ufology would have been paralyzed. But the great irony is, and here's what I think more and more, because I'm in many ways like you. I've always turned to Keel and Valet and to their theories as a way forward. I think what we have to do, though, people like you and I, Steve, is I think it's easy for us to kind of stand in their footprints and still say the same mantras. I've been guilty of it for years, but I think ufology's kind of moved past us. I'm just talking about one example of paranormal research. Ufology seems to have kept going. So it's like it didn't. There are great thinkers in the field who did pick up on that kind of stuff. I mean, I would think Joshua Kuchin would be an example. You're an example. Greg Bishop's an example. There's Nick Redfern's an example. There's people who began to look outside. But that great cultural wave of extraterrestrial hypothesis just kept going forward. And we see now today with the Tic Tac videos and the recent hearings in Washington, this almost returned to the 1950s, like nothing Keel or Valet or any of those people ever wrote even mattered. It's gone back again to, there's strange things in the sky which we can't identify, with this underlying kind of assumption, well, they're not ours, there must be ET. So do you feel that? Do you feel like we haven't really, I know before you said you thought we'd advanced, but my gut feeling, or my interpretation is we haven't advanced. Do you feel in some ways we're stuck, and in some ways we have advanced? What's your kind of position?
Well, when I say we've advanced, I guess I'm talking about a select group, and it's that group that is looked at with disdain by other people. I mean, we do see the patterns and parallels that are there, and I'm much different in the way I'm thinking about things from the 60s and early 70s to the present. So I feel like, that's advancement, but it's not across the board. And you're right. When people, it's like, maybe we're making some progress. Oh, wait a minute, look at over here. Look at this cool Tic Tac video. It must be a nuts and bolts craft. But you're right, because, when so many people, I notice sometimes when I come on shows, people have never heard some of this stuff. They have no idea. And, I discovered Keel early on. I even saw him on one of these old TV shows. Remember UHF stations, the old with the funky little antenna. You get those cool channel 50 and 62 or whatever they were. Well, I was getting all these syndicated shows out of New York back in the 60s, and there was John Keel and Ivan Sanderson on the Alan Burke show. And Alan Burke was one of these guys that would have the weirdos on, but he was very respectful to Ivan Sanderson. But I'm not sure where I was going with that, but
how some of us have escaped that kind of box of thinking.
Right. But there are so many people that don't know anything about Operation Trojan Horse, or the bizarre stuff that happened in the Mothman Prophecies, or the Eighth Tower, where or all his numerous articles, or again Jacques Vallée's the other one. They've established that there is so much more to this, and there are connections out there. So when people see these pretty incredible videos, it's kind of annoying that they're always focused on ET. ET is so passé, right? Well, maybe not really. I mean, maybe that there is an element of that as well. But yeah, overall, people in the mainstream ufology, paranormal study, no, people are still kind of stuck in their boxes. But but there is, if you look at the research of people like, again, Keel, Vallée, and the more modern people like Cutchin and so forth, they've demonstrated that there's something so much deeper and so much more mysterious going on.
Yeah, I'm coming more and more to think, as I mentioned before, that there isn't one phenomenon. That the Tic Tac videos, for example, are probably, I would put money on them being advanced military craft, probably advanced US military craft, and they test them on their pilots to see how they react. That's my interpretation of what Tic Tac probably is. And they'll roll out pilots, you might notice, and the pilot will say, well, it's not one of ours. I know that. How on earth would a Navy pilot know if it was one of ours or not? They know what they're flying, the same as the Russians know what they're flying and the Chinese know what they're flying, but your average Navy pilot doesn't know what they're testing out of skunk works or equivalents. They have no idea, but for obvious reasons, there's a need to know basis. So to have somebody flying the current state of the art technology and not knowing the beyond the state of the art technology being tested, just because they don't recognize what it is, means absolutely nothing. And then if somebody sees a light floating around their back 40, that mightn't be an extraterrestrial craft either. That might just be, some type of weird electromagnetic phenomenon. And the bedroom visitation somebody might have tonight might just be sleep paralysis. And then again, somebody might have a genuine experience with the anomalous, another intelligence that isn't ours, and that might be something else again. But there's this overwhelming desire, I think, in humankind to make sense of things. So if you don't believe in UFOs, if you're in the scientific community that doesn't believe, the way Fort talked about it, you just ignore all this phenomenon. But if you do believe in UFOs being extraterrestrial, you tend to want to bring all the phenomena into your own box. And I think that's the problem with our thinking as a species. I think it's hard for us to go, hang on, let's dissect all of this. There mightn't be a simple solution to it.
That sounds good. You solved it.
I don't know if it's solvable, to be honest. But
I know it's anyway. It's been a really amazing ride. But there's still a part of me that I love to open up some of the old contact ebooks, and I will suspend my disbelief because it's so nice to think that the Space Brothers might have actually come down and talked to George Adamski in that California desert about peace, love, and brotherhood. Even though I know it's nonsense, but sometimes the contactee stories blur with the abduction accounts as well. So, but then there's the other factor of, I suspect that the government has done some manipulating and testing, testing the limits of belief. And I think Nick Redfern has uncovered all kinds of things through the Freedom of Information that would suggest that perhaps some of the Men in Black visitations were just the government seeing what they could what kind of things they could plant and see what would evolve from them later. So that's another factor that comes in to pollute things,
Yeah, I think that's what makes it difficult. Something Vallée talked about as an information scientist way back, I think, even in his pre-Passport to Magonia books, in books like Anatomy of a Phenomenon and Challenge to Science, he talked about finding the signal in the noise. And it's noisier now than ever. It's harder to find that signal now than ever.
Exactly.
Well, it was just an absolute joy to have you back, Steve. I've got to get down to visit you down in Point Pleasant sometime. I'm not going to crash on your couch. Don't worry.
You can't right now. It's got too much stuff on it. I've actually got a narrow path. I can still walk from one side of the house to the other. I actually had to, when I was building these shelves, I put together about 18 shelves that I bought and put together. And I'm the guy that hates those instructions to put these things together. I had to, in order to get it into my library, I had to move boxes out of the way. Then I could move the empty shelves in, and then I could start to open up some of the boxes and put some books in there. So it's like I'm living in a Rubik's Cube that never is solved.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's the problem with being a bibliophile. I know that feeling. I'm finally getting on top of my library. I bought an awful lot of shelves to try to facilitate it. So I feel your pain, but Jen and I do have to get down there, visit you, come and visit
definitely.
the Mothman Museum. And in the meantime, sorry, you go.
I just hope to have a presentable house where I can show off my library and people can actually sit down and have coffee and have a discussion. So that will happen one of these days. But yes, I'm working at the Mothman Museum, which is an absolute blast. I never considered moving to Point Pleasant because that's my special place, my vacation spot. If you move to your vacation spot, where the hell are you going to go on vacation now? That's what I want to know. But it's the main reason I'm there is Jeff Walmsley that started the museum. The regular workers there are so busy selling T-shirts and so forth that they don't really have a lot of time to answer questions. So I'm the guy that in November of '66 in junior high saw that first news report that went all over the world about the two couples chased by the Mothman. So of course I couldn't drive and I couldn't play investigator, but now I can. At least I can pretend. And but I've been really following it all those decades and following John Keel and his research. So the museum is just a blast. I've gotten to some great conversations, and you talk to people, and you can tell if they want to be left alone, you do that. But I'm telling people about the Mothman Festival, and I have some personal. I met the one of the bridge survivors that went down on the bridge, who was a truck driver. And there's the articles right in the Mothman Museum. So I can point to people and say, I met this gentleman a few years ago at the 50th anniversary of the remembrance ceremony for the bridge collapse. And he talked about how he's going across the bridge. How in the film, The Mothman Prophecies, Richard Gere has a lot of time to warn people to get off the bridge, when in fact it took 30 to 40 seconds. And so here's Bill. He's going across the bridge. And it sounds funny at first, but you know how gentlemen will loosen their britches a bit to be more comfortable driving? Well, the bridge, everything went in. He went through the passenger window of the truck, right arm first. So he hit the water. His pants are dragging behind him, but they're not coming off because of the 1960s pant cuffs, right? Can't get over his shoes. And then he goes to the bottom. Now, this is December 15th. It's 20 degrees outside. The sun's almost down. and the whole bridge has been collapsing. He's coming up to the surface. The currents are pulling him up, and something grabs his pants, debris or whatever, and starts pulling him back under. Fortunately, he kicked himself free. He's holding onto some of the material he was hauling, and a tugboat captain saw him and pulled him up out of the water, probably moments before he would have died of hypothermia. So, I have these different, there's a magazine there that we put together. It went in '68 when I was in high school. It has Mothman on the cover. That's displayed there. So I have these kind of cool personal touches besides all the information that this brain has gathered over the years. So it's just an absolute blast. And then I'll go outside and people are taking pictures of the Mothman statue, but so I will come up and see if they want their whole family taken together, so one doesn't have to stand back. And so it's just I'm getting paid to do this. It's just amazing.
Well, I can't think of anybody better to do it. I want a personal tour when I come down though. Jen and I have to have a personal tour from you, Steve.
We'll go. There's actually some cool history. I'm not real well versed in the history. I know the weird stuff better, but we'll go out to the TNT area. The sky's the limit. We'll explore everything.
Well, we'll hopefully be down there in the not too distant future. And how do people listen or get a hold of your shows and what you're up to? Because I know you're starting those podcasts again, which are always fantastic.
Right. I'm going to be on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm going to be on their flagship show again soon, since I've been off for a few months. And you can easily find that on it's the High Strangeness Factor. And I'm on Facebook, Steve Ward. When I used to live in Michigan near Battle Creek, if you put Steve Ward and Battle Creek in, you could find me easy. So I think if you type in Steve Ward and Point Pleasant, I'll come up on. I don't have any special websites yet or anything like that. But come and see me at the Mothman Museum if you can't find me on Facebook.
That's what everybody should do. And until we have you back on the show, or until we get to the Mothman Museum, whatever happens first, thank you for coming on, and keep it weird.
Thank you so much.
Keep it weird.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it